Richard Sterling, a titan of tech in New York City, lived by a single, ruthless creed: control. Success, for him, was a meticulously crafted machine where every cog, every person, functioned precisely as ordained. Chaos was anathema, and failure unthinkable. This rigid philosophy extended to his personal life, amplified since his divorce 4 years prior. His children, 6-year-old Max and Lily, were provided for, certainly. Love, in Richard's world, was measured in trust funds, elite schools, and designer toys. He toiled relentlessly, ensuring their material comfort, blind to the emotional chasm widening between them. While Richard commanded his empire, Emily Mitchell, their nanny hired after the separation, quietly filled the void. She was the school run driver, the bedtime story reader, the monster under the bed slayer. Unwittingly, Emily became the safe harbor his children desperately needed. Initially, Richard viewed Emily as a flawless employee, efficient, discreet, professional, exactly what he demanded. But a disquieting shift began to occur. Emily wasn't just doing her job, she was weaving herself into the fabric of their lives. Lily started calling her Aunt Emily, and Max confided in her secrets he wouldn't even whisper to his own father. Richard observed this from a distance, a knot of irritation tightening in his gut. Something had to be done, but emotional complexities were outside his comfort zone, a messy equation he lacked the tools to solve. He was a man of action, not feelings. One afternoon, buried in spreadsheets in his home office overlooking Central Park, laughter drifted in from the terrace. Peering out, he saw Emily playing tag with Max and Lily. They darted between the potted trees, their joyous shrieks echoing in the crisp city air, oblivious to his presence. Lily's face, usually shadowed with a quiet reserve, was radiant with unadulterated joy, a sight Richard rarely witnessed in his own company. A wave of cold anger washed over him. Too attached, he thought, his jaw clenching. Nannies weren't supposed to be family. They were hired help, rule followers, order maintainers. But out there, on his terrace, Emily was crossing an invisible line. The unease he'd been suppressing for months now surged, demanding attention. He pushed back his chair, the children's laughter grating on his nerves like a deliberate insult. They were laughing with her, connecting with her, while he remained a distant, shadowy figure in their penthouse. Richard stormed out of his office, his footsteps echoing on the polished floors. He crossed the vast living room and burst onto the terrace. The scene that greeted him, Emily swinging Max high in the air, Lily spinning in circles, giggling uncontrollably, was the embodiment of everything that unsettled him. The raw, unfiltered happiness in his children's eyes, the easy intimacy they shared with Emily, felt like a personal affront. "Emily!" he barked, his voice sharp and glacial. Emily froze mid-swing, gently lowering Max to the ground. The children's laughter died abruptly, replaced by a confused silence as they sensed the sudden shift in their father's demeanor. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard demanded, his anger barely contained beneath a veneer of ice control. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off with a raised hand. "I am their father," he stated, advancing on her. "And you are just the nanny. Your job is childcare, not closeness, not acting like family. Detach yourself from my children." The words, though delivered with chilling calm, sliced through the air like shards of glass. Emily's composure faltered, the hurt evident in her eyes. Max and Lily stared at their father, bewildered by his sudden fury. "Mr. Sterling," Emily began, her voice trembling slightly. I was just playing with them. I swear." "I don't pay you to play with my children, Emily," he interrupted, his gaze hardening. "I pay you to do a job, and that includes maintaining professional distance. If you can't manage that, then your services are no longer required." A heavy silence descended. The children, moments before bubbling with joy, now stood frozen, their faces etched with terror. Max, tears welling, clung to Emily's arm. Lily stared at her father, a mixture of confusion and dawning fear clouding her bright eyes. "Daddy, no!" Lily cried, her voice cracking. "Please don't send Aunt Emily away." The words tore at Emily's heart. She lowered her gaze, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. Richard remained unmoved, his expression as cold and unyielding as granite. "Emily," he said, as if finalizing a business transaction, "you can leave now. Your things will be sent to you tomorrow." Emily took a shaky breath, her eyes lingering on the children for a final heartbreaking moment. She nodded silently and turned towards the penthouse door. Max and Lily erupted in sobs, but Richard didn't flinch. As the door closed behind Emily, the terrace, once vibrant with life and laughter, became a tomb of silence. Richard turned to his children, expecting some reaction, but instead he was met with a chilling void in their eyes, an emptiness he was utterly unprepared to fill. Popcorn, Richard muttered to himself, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He retreated back to his office, the silence in the penthouse now a suffocating weight. He tried to bury himself in work, but the image of his children running into Emily's arms, their unrestrained laughter echoing in his ears, kept intruding. The irritation, however, wasn't solely directed at Emily. Deep down, a truth he desperately tried to deny gnawed at him. He, their father, couldn't evoke the kind of joy and comfort that the nanny, a mere employee, could. But as always, he masked his vulnerability with a cold, unwavering conviction that he had done the right thing. Night draped over the city, plunging the penthouse into an oppressive quiet that amplified Emily's absence. When he called the children for dinner, he hoped for a semblance of normalcy, but the dining room scene was profoundly unsettling. Max and Lily sat at the table, their eyes red and swollen from crying. They were silent, listlessly pushing food around their plates. Their appetites seemingly vanished with Emily. Richard cleared his throat, trying to break the ice. "How was school today?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, a clumsy attempt at reconciliation. Neither child responded. Lily simply shrugged, staring blankly at her plate, while Max gripped his fork so tightly his knuckles turned white. Frustration began to simmer within Richard, but he tamped it down. He knew he needed patience, a virtue he rarely exercised. His instinct was to fix problems swiftly, as he did in business, but his usual tactics were useless here. "You need to eat," he insisted, trying to keep the irritation from his voice. Finally, Max's head snapped up. The look in his son's eyes stopped Richard cold. It was a quiet fury, a nascent resentment he'd never imagined seeing in such a young child. Max looked like he was about to explode, and when he spoke, his voice vibrated with suppressed rage. "You made Aunt Emily leave," Max shouted, his voice shattering the silence. Lily burst into fresh sobs, her small body convulsing. Richard froze, utterly blindsided by the outburst. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. "She was the only one who really cared," Max continued, pushing back his chair and standing. "You don't get it, Dad. We hate you." The words struck Richard with the force of a physical blow. He sat motionless, watching as Max stormed out of the room, slamming the door with such force the penthouse seemed to shudder. Lily, still sobbing uncontrollably, scrambled after him, tripping over her own feet as she ran upstairs. Richard sank back into his chair, stunned. "We hate you." Max's words echoed in his mind, a brutal, undeniable truth. Never, even in his darkest thoughts, had he imagined hearing such venom from his own child. The pain was a raw, visceral ache, something no amount of money could alleviate. The night crawled by in a torment of sleeplessness. Richard wandered through the silent penthouse, the shadows stretching across the walls like accusing fingers. He could hear Lily's muffled sobs from her room, and a desperate ache to comfort her warred with his utter helplessness. In the pre-dawn hours, after a night of agonizing self-reproach, he resolved to try again. Tomorrow would be different. He would find a way to mend the shattered pieces of his family. But morning arrived with a devastating surprise. The silence that greeted him was different, heavier, laced with an ominous undertone. As he descended to the living room, he noticed the children weren't there. No cartoons blaring, no toys scattered on the rug. Unusual. Max and Lily were always early risers, even on weekends. It was already 9 a.m. A cold dread coiled in his stomach. Richard retraced his steps upstairs, a growing unease tightening his chest. He pushed open Max's door. The bed was empty, unmade, as if he'd left in a hurry. Lily's room was also deserted. A chill snaked down his spine. He raced from room to room, frantically searching for any sign of them, but the penthouse remained eerily empty, swallowed by silence. His heart hammered against his ribs. They weren't anywhere. Richard fought to stay calm, desperately clinging to the hope that they were outside, hiding, playing some elaborate game. But as minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity and his frantic search yielded nothing, panic began to claw at him. He bolted out of the penthouse, scanning the terrace, shouting their names into the morning air. Nothing. Not a sound. The ice tendrils of fear tightened their grip. He ran to the penthouse door and saw it, slightly ajar. They had gone out. But where and why? The horrifying realization that his children had run away from home slammed into him, stealing his breath. He refused to believe it, even as the evidence screamed at him. His heart pounded like a war drum, suffocating him with guilt and terror. Richard stumbled back into the penthouse, grabbing his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial. He called friends, neighbors, the doorman. No one had seen them. His mind spiraled, a vortex of fear and self-blame. What should he do? Call the police? Yes, that was the only option, but paralyzing fear and guilt held him captive. He had failed them before, and now his ultimate failure was unfolding in a catastrophic way. How could I let this happen? He whispered, the desperation choking him. He, who controlled billions, was now utterly powerless, at the mercy of a situation far beyond any boardroom negotiation. The shrill ring of the phone shattered the suffocating silence. Richard snatched it up, his voice hoarse with desperation. Hello? Richard? The voice on the other end was familiar, gentle, and a wave of dizzying relief washed over him as he recognized Emily's voice. Emily! He gasped, barely able to breathe. Where are my kids? Are they with you? A pause hung in the air, and then Emily's voice, firm yet laced with compassion, filled his ear. I found them in Central Park. They were wandering alone, completely lost. Max told me they left home because they couldn't take it anymore. They're with me now, safe. A tidal wave of relief, so potent it was almost painful, crashed over Richard, followed by a crushing wave of shame. His children had run away. They had put themselves in danger because of him, because of his callousness. He stammered, words failing him. What could he possibly say to Emily after the way he had treated her? She, the woman he dismissed as just the nanny, had been the only one to truly care for his children when he had so spectacularly failed. I'm on my way, he managed to choke out. Please, tell them I'm coming. Of course, Richard, Emily replied, her voice softening. But then she added, a note of seriousness creeping in. We need to talk, Richard. He hung up and bolted from the penthouse, his mind a maelstrom of relief and dread. He was racing towards his children, towards safety, but also towards a reckoning he knew he couldn't escape. This wasn't just a crisis to be managed. It was a brutal reflection of everything he had neglected, everything he had gotten wrong. When he arrived at Emily's apartment, she was waiting for him at the door. Max and Lily were inside, huddled together on the couch. Richard stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching them. They sat close, their small bodies intertwined, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes distant. When they saw him, there was no rush to greet him, no joyous reunion. They remained separate, emotionally and physically. Emily approached him, her arms crossed, stopping a few feet away. They ran away, Richard, she began, her voice gentle but firm. They think you don't love them. I know, he choked out, his voice thick with guilt. I messed up, and now they don't trust me, do they? Emily sighed, her gaze unwavering. It's not about trust, Richard, it's about love. They don't feel loved. They don't need expensive gifts or material comfort. They need you. They needed to know that when they needed a hug, you'd be there. That when they were sad, you would care, but you were always distant. I'll change, he said, the words ripped from his soul, imbued with a conviction he had never felt before. I know I can't fix this overnight, but I'll do whatever it takes. Emily studied him for a long moment, searching his eyes for sincerity. Then she nodded slightly. They need to hear it from you, she said, stepping aside to let him enter. For the first time in his life, Richard was adrift, without control, without answers. In that moment, he finally understood. For his children, it had never been about money or power. It was about something infinitely more valuable, something he had so carelessly neglected: love. Richard stepped inside Emily's apartment, a wave of unfamiliar warmth washing over him. The silence here was different from the oppressive void in his penthouse. This silence was comforting, filled with an unspoken empathy. As he walked into the living room, his gaze locked on Max and Lily. They were still huddled together, their faces streaked with tears, the raw pain of abandonment etched in their eyes. Seeing their emptiness twisted his gut. He had always prided himself on being the provider, the perfect father in his own distorted view. Now, the truth, stark and brutal, crashed down on him. Slowly, hesitantly, Lily untangled herself from Max and walked towards Richard. Her small face, still tear-stained, looked up at him. Her voice was barely a whisper. Dad, do you really promise you won't leave us alone again? The weight of her question crushed him. Leave them alone. That was the image he had projected, a distant, unloving father. Lily's tear-filled eyes reflected the profound pain he had inflicted. He knew empty promises were worthless. He had to offer more, much more. "I promise, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will never let you feel this way again. Never." She hesitated, then leaned into him, wrapping her small arms around his neck. The sob that escaped her was a plea for forgiveness, a desperate yearning for love. He held her tightly, as if this embrace was his last chance to make amends. In that moment, he felt the full weight of what was at stake. Max remained on the couch, watching the scene with guarded eyes. The hurt in his gaze was undeniable. Richard knew winning back his son would be a longer, more delicate process. Max didn't want words, he wanted action, proof that his father wouldn't fail them again. "Max," Richard began, unsure how to bridge the chasm between them. "I know you're hurt. I know I failed you and your sister. But I'm here to change that. And I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back." Max crossed his arms, his resistance palpable. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, tangled with the fear of hoping, of believing, and then being let down again. He looked at Richard, his eyes narrowed, filled with a resentment that could break any father's heart. "You always say that, Dad," Max murmured, his voice raw. "You always say you'll change, but you never do." The words landed like a physical blow. Max was right. Richard had made countless promises, to the children, to himself, and had broken them all. Now, words were meaningless. He needed to prove himself, through action, through unwavering commitment. Before Richard could respond, Emily stepped forward, her calm presence a soothing balm in the tense atmosphere. She understood these children, their fears, their needs better than anyone. She knew how to navigate this fragile reconciliation. "Max, your dad is trying," Emily said, her voice firm but gentle. "He knows he's made mistakes, and I know you're hurt, but maybe it's time to give him a chance to show you he can do things differently. It's hard to believe after everything, but change starts slowly, and I'll be here to make sure he keeps the promises he's making." Max hesitated. Emily's words had always been a source of stability, of comfort in his and Lily's lives. Seeing her standing beside his father, mediating this fragile truce, made his resentment waver. He was still hurt, deeply so, but a flicker of hope ignited within him. Richard, sensing a fragile opening, slowly approached Max. This time, he didn't reach for a hug. He knelt in front of his son, meeting his gaze directly. "I know words aren't enough," Richard said, his voice steady, fighting back the overwhelming emotion. "But I'm here, Max, and I'll be here every day until you feel like you can trust me again. I won't give up on you, Max. Not this time." Silence hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Richard waited, the weight of Max's decision pressing down on him. Then, slowly, Max uncrossed his arms. Without a word, he took a small step towards his father. No hug, no declaration of forgiveness, but the small gesture was enough. Richard knew, with a surge of hope, that there was a chance for redemption. He offered Max a small, hesitant smile, a silent promise of a new beginning. Emily watched, relief washing over her. She knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, but seeing that tiny shift in Max's heart, that flicker of hope, was enough. Reconciliation, however difficult, was possible. "Let's take you both home," Richard said, his gaze shifting between Max and Lily. "And this time, I'll really be there, every step of the way." The drive back to the penthouse was quiet, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of fear and guilt that had haunted Richard before. This silence was different, expectant, filled with a tentative hope. Max and Lily were exhausted, emotionally and physically drained, but Richard felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years, as if the crushing weight of guilt had lifted, if only slightly. He knew the real work was just beginning. Back at the penthouse, Richard broke the old patterns. Instead of letting the children retreat to their rooms, isolating themselves, he kept them close. They sat together in the living room, a new, fragile family unit. "I want you both to know," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "From now on, anything that bothers you, any feelings you have, you can come to me. I don't want you to ever feel alone again. I can't change the past, but I can make sure the future is different." Lily climbed onto his lap, something she hadn't done in years. Richard felt her small body relax against him, a sign that the bond, however frayed, still existed. He had to fight to mend it, to strengthen it. Max remained more reserved, but even in his guarded eyes, Richard saw a flicker of something new, a hesitant hope. He wanted to believe. As the children drifted off to sleep on the couch, exhaustion finally claiming them, Richard stared at the ceiling, breathing deeply. Their presence beside him, the simple weight of their small bodies, was a constant, powerful reminder of the chance he had been given. "Richard?" Emily's soft voice broke through his thoughts. She stood by the doorway, watching them, a gentle understanding in her eyes. "Now you understand," she said quietly. "Understand what really matters." She paused, her gaze searching his. "I just hope, from now on, you never forget." Richard nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. The journey had just begun. That night, climbing the stairs to the penthouse bedrooms, Richard felt profoundly different. He wasn't retreating to his office, to the cold, isolating world of spreadsheets and deals. He was going upstairs to care for his children. A fundamental shift had occurred within him, a sense of responsibility that was no longer forced, but a genuine, heartfelt need to be present, to make amends. He tucked Lily into bed first, smoothing the blankets around her with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. Her sleepy eyes fluttered open, a soft light in their depths. "Daddy?" she whispered as he adjusted her pillow. "Yes, sweetheart." Richard leaned closer, waiting. "Are you going to stay with us tomorrow too?" The question, so simple, carried an immense emotional weight. She needed reassurance, a promise that he wouldn't vanish again, as he had so many times before. Richard swallowed hard, feeling the full weight of his responsibility. "I will, Lily," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "I'll be with you every day from now on. That's my promise." Lily smiled, a shy, genuine smile that lit up her face. Her eyes sparkled for a moment before she drifted back to sleep. Richard stood there watching his daughter, his heart heavy with regret, but filled with a newfound determination. He couldn't fail them again. He moved to Max's room. As expected, his son was still awake, lying on his side, facing the wall as if trying to shut out the world. Richard hesitated at the door. He knew reaching Max would be harder. His son's heart was wounded, and even after the tentative reconciliation, the path to healing would be long. He slowly entered the room and sat on the edge of Max's bed. The tension in the air was palpable. Max didn't turn to look at him, but Richard knew he was awake. "Max," Richard began, his voice low and measured, "I know you're still hurt, and I know just saying sorry won't fix everything right away. But I want you to know that I'm here, not just today, but for good." Max remained silent. Richard wasn't discouraged. Patience, he was learning, was essential. "I failed as a father, Max," Richard admitted, the words heavy with self-reproach. "I put work, money, and my own pride above you. And that was wrong. You and Lily are everything to me, even if it took me too long to realize it." Finally, Max shifted, slowly turning to face his father. His eyes were watery, but there was a newfound resolve in them, mirroring Richard's own. The pain was still there, but something seemed to soften, to thaw. "Are you going to do it again, Dad?" Max asked, his voice direct, almost accusatory. "Are you going to promise and then disappear like you always do?" The question struck Richard like a physical blow. His past failures had earned him this distrust. But this was his chance to prove he was different now. "No, Max, I won't disappear again," Richard replied, his voice firm, unwavering. "I promise you, son. I'm really here, always. And I'll prove it, every day, no matter how long it takes for you to believe me." Max didn't respond immediately. He just lay there, searching his father's eyes, processing the words. The pain lingered, but something seemed to give way, a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. After a long moment, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if willing to offer his father a tiny, fragile chance. Relief washed over Richard. He reached out and gently stroked Max's hair, a gesture of affection he hadn't offered in years. Max didn't pull away. Even that small acceptance was progress. Richard left the room with a lighter heart, but fully aware that the journey had just begun. The next morning, Richard woke up earlier than he had in years. Not to rush to the office, not to bury himself in emails, but to make breakfast. Simple things, pancakes, juice, but made by him for his children. When Max and Lily came downstairs, they stopped short, surprised to find their father in the kitchen, apron on, flipping pancakes. Lily smiled shyly. Max watched, still cautious. "I made breakfast," Richard said, trying to sound casual, though the tension was evident in his voice. He wanted this gesture to be a step towards normalcy, towards family life. The children sat at a table. The mood was still quiet, but the oppressive sadness, the fear had lifted. It was a new beginning. Richard, knowing this was just the first step of a long journey, felt a profound sense of gratitude. After breakfast, Richard drove them to school. The ride was peaceful, mostly silent. As he said goodbye, he knelt down to their level. "I'll see you later, okay?" he said, smiling. "And tonight, maybe we can watch a movie together? How does that sound?" Lily nodded, a small smile mirroring his. Max hesitated, then gave a barely perceptible nod. Small gestures, but filled with immense meaning. Richard watched his children walk into school, a fragile hope blossoming in his chest. The journey would be long, but he was determined to walk every step with patience, with love. This time, he wouldn't fail. The days that followed were filled with a strange sense of renewal. Richard woke early, made breakfast, drove the kids to school, meticulously building a routine that had never existed before. Simple, ordinary things for other parents, but for him, monumental efforts and precious opportunities to show Max and Lily his commitment. Yet, the silence persisted, especially with Max. He maintained an emotional distance, a barrier Richard struggled to penetrate. The wall of distrust remained stubbornly in place. "How was school today?" Richard would ask every afternoon, trying to open a channel of communication. Lily, always more outgoing, would eagerly recount her day, her art projects, playground games. Max, however, offered only monosyllabic answers, clearly unwilling to engage. Richard resisted the urge to push. He knew time was his ally, but his anxiety gnawed at him. He longed to accelerate the healing, to see his children truly happy, to feel like he had earned their love back. But every time he tried to rush, Max's resistance hardened. Then, one afternoon, Emily offered a suggestion that shifted everything. "Richard," she began, as they talked in his penthouse, "I've been thinking maybe you could try something more special, something that would show Max you're really trying to reconnect." Richard frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Emily smiled, her usual calm presence reassuring. "Something you two can do together, an activity that shows Max you care about what he likes. I know you've been working hard on the routines, and that's important, but Max needs to feel like you're genuinely interested in what makes him happy." Richard considered her words. He had never paid close attention to his children's interests. Work had consumed him, blinding him to their inner lives. Now, it was time to change. "Do you have any ideas?" Richard asked, intrigued. Emily tilted her head, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "He's always loved building things, right? Maybe you could spend some time building something together. A model, maybe? Or even that airplane project he never finished. The unfinished wooden airplane. Vaguely, Richard remembered it, a half-completed project gathering dust on a shelf in Max's room. Perhaps this was the key, a way to bridge the gap. I think that might work," Richard said, a flicker of hope igniting within him. "I'll talk to him tonight." That evening, after dinner, Richard knocked softly on Max's bedroom door. He took a deep breath before entering. Max was sitting on his bed, a book in his hands, but he snapped it shut as Richard entered, his expression wary. "Can I come in?" Richard asked, his nerves tightening. Max shrugged, a non-committal gesture, but Richard took it as permission. He stepped into the room, sat in the chair near the bed, and looked around, trying to appear casual. "I was thinking," he began, forcing a lightness into his voice. "Do you remember that airplane model you started building?" Max didn't respond immediately, but a flicker of recognition crossed his face. Richard continued, "I thought maybe we could try to finish it together. What do you think?" Finally, Max looked at his father, his eyes assessing the offer. Hesitation warred with a curiosity he tried to conceal. "You never wanted to build anything with me before," Max said, the bluntness of his words a painful reminder of Richard's past neglect. "I know, son," Richard replied sincerely, "and that was my mistake. But I'm trying to fix that now. If you'd like, we could start tomorrow after school." A moment of silence stretched between them as Max considered. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. "Okay," he said, the word devoid of emotion, but the agreement itself was a victory. Richard felt a wave of relief, but he kept his enthusiasm in check. He knew this was just a step. A model airplane wouldn't magically erase the past, but it was a start. And that was all they needed. The next evening, after dinner, Richard and Max sat together in the living room, surrounded by the scattered pieces of the model airplane. The soft glow of a lamp illuminated the scene. Lily, initially curious, hovered for a while, then drifted off to play in her room. At first, the silence between Richard and Max was almost unbearable, but slowly, as they deciphered the instructions, fitted pieces together, the tension began to ease. Max seemed more focused on the project than on avoiding his father, a subtle but significant shift. "I think this piece goes here," Richard said, pointing to one of the larger wooden components. Max quickly corrected him, showing him the correct placement. Richard smiled, accepting the correction with humility, a small victory. As time passed, the silence shifted. It wasn't comfortable, but it was different. They were working together, side by side. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt like they were building more than just a plane. They were building trust, brick by fragile brick, mending the bonds that had been so badly broken. By the end of the evening, the airplane was still unfinished, but the project had taken on a new meaning. Richard felt a spark of hope, small but alive. The months that followed brought a profound transformation to Richard Sterling and his family. The penthouse, once echoing with silence, now vibrated with children's laughter, lively conversations, a warmth and energy that had been absent for years. Richard was present, both physically and emotionally, keeping his promise to be the father Max and Lily needed. The journey had been arduous, but the constant effort to regain his children's trust was yielding results. Max, once withdrawn and distant, was slowly opening up. The model airplane, proudly displayed in the living room, became a tangible symbol of their growing connection. Lily, always affectionate, now radiated unbridled joy, running into her father's arms each day, filling the penthouse with her infectious laughter. Beyond his relationship with his children, Richard began to see Emily in a new light, not just as the nanny who had saved his family, but as someone essential to all of them, including him. Emily had been the unwavering support, the constant presence that had anchored Max and Lily during the darkest times. Now, Richard could no longer deny the feelings blossoming within him. One day, during breakfast, a family ritual they now cherished, Lily, ever the inquisitive one, asked a question that stopped everyone in their tracks. "Daddy," she piped up, her voice clear and innocent, "why don't you and Aunt Emily get married?" Silence descended. Richard froze, nearly dropping the pancake batter bowl. Emily, across the table, flushed crimson, her eyes wide with surprise. Max, setting the table, paused, a small smile playing on his lips, clearly curious to hear his father's response. "Married?" Richard repeated, chuckling nervously to mask his shock. "Where did you get that idea, Lilybug?" Lily, ever pragmatic, shrugged as if the answer was obvious. "Because you and Aunt Emily are together all the time now, and she takes care of us. I think it'd be nice if she lived with us for real. Don't you think, Max?" Max glanced at his sister, then at his father, and nodded shyly. Richard was speechless. He exchanged a fleeting glance with Emily, who looked equally stunned. But in that brief moment, their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them, something that had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. Richard smiled, trying to deflect, to change the subject, but Lily's innocent question lingered, echoing in his mind throughout the day. No matter how he tried to dismiss it, a new thought began to take root. What if Lily was right? What if Emily was more than just the woman who had held his family together? What if she was the missing piece, the one who could finally make his life whole? That night, after tucking Mac and Lily into bed, Richard went to the kitchen. Emily was there, finishing up the dishes. A nervous energy thrummed through him. He knew he had to talk to her, to address the feelings that had been growing, impossible to ignore. "Emily," he said, approaching her slowly, "we need to talk." She stopped, turned, sensing the seriousness in his voice. "Sure, Richard. What's going on?" Richard took a deep breath, trying to organize the swirling thoughts in his head. He knew he couldn't keep burying his feelings. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his gaze fixed on the floor, then lifting, meeting her eyes, "about what Lily said earlier today." Emily smiled nervously. "Oh, that. It was just a child's question. You know how they are, always curious." She tried to dismiss it, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe it makes more sense than we think," Richard interrupted, his voice low but steady. Emily fell silent, a question in her eyes. "I never thanked you properly, Emily, for everything you've done for me, for my kids. When I was lost, you were there. When I failed, you kept them strong, and little by little you brought back the joy I thought I'd lost forever. I don't know how to express what that means to me." He paused, watching her reaction, then continued, his voice softening. "But more than that, I've realized something important. I've fallen in love with you, Emily." Emily stood frozen, Richard's words hanging in the air, a confession she hadn't dared to dream of. She blinked, trying to process the reality of his words. "Richard," she began, searching for the right response. I didn't expect to hear this." "I know," he replied, a soft smile gracing his lips. "I didn't expect to feel this way either, but the truth is, you've become such an integral part of my life. of my kids' lives in a way I never imagined. And now, I can't picture a future without you. He paused, taking a step closer. Emily, I want you to be a part of my family, not just as the woman who helped raise my children, but as someone I can share my life with. Emily, will you marry me? Silence descended, thick with emotion. Emily looked into Richard's eyes, tears welling. She had never allowed herself to believe this could happen. Her heart raced. A hesitant smile bloomed on her face. Richard, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I never thought this moment would come. I thought you were focused on reconnecting with your kids and... She trailed off, taking a shaky breath. The truth is, Richard, I've always felt something for you, but I never believed it could be real. Richard gently took her hands in his. It is real, Emily, he said, his voice tender, and it's right here, right in front of us. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. I know I'm asking a lot, but you're already part of our family. Max and Lily love you like a mother, and now I realize that I love you too. Tears streamed down Emily's face, tears of relief, of joy, of a happiness so profound it overwhelmed her. She laughed softly, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Yes, Richard, she whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, I accept. I want to marry you. The news of Richard and Emily's engagement ignited a spark of pure joy in Max and Lily. For them, Emily had always been family. Now, knowing it would be official, permanent, filled their hearts with a happiness that overflowed. Lily, especially, was ecstatic, throwing herself into wedding planning, buzzing with ideas about flowers and dresses. Max, more reserved, simply smiled, content to see his family finally truly whole. The wedding ceremony, held in their penthouse overlooking the twinkling lights of the city, was intimate, attended only by close friends and family. But for everyone present, especially Richard, Emily, Max, and Lily, the moment was monumental. The family, once fractured by Richard's ambition and neglect, was being rebuilt, not on a foundation of wealth or empty promises, but on the bedrock of genuine love and hard-won reconciliation. That night, after the ceremony, Richard looked at his new wife, at his children, a profound sense of peace settling over him. He was no longer the cold, arrogant titan of tech, convinced that money could solve everything. He had learned, through pain and redemption, that the true treasures in life were not material possessions, but the intangible riches of connection, presence, and love. Richard Sterling's journey was a testament to the transformative power of humility and reconnection. He had once believed financial success was enough, that providing materially was sufficient fatherhood. He had been profoundly wrong. Through loss and rediscovery, he had learned that love wasn't about grand pronouncements or extravagant gestures. It was found in the small, everyday acts of presence, care, and unwavering devotion to those he cherished most. Emily, in turn, had shown Richard and his children the enduring strength of unconditional love, her patience and resilience a beacon in their darkest hours. The most valuable things in life, Richard finally understood, couldn't be bought, couldn't be commanded. They were earned, nurtured, and cherished, built with time, patience, and above all, love. It wasn't about avoiding mistakes, but about being willing to learn from them, to grow, to love more deeply, more sincerely. Love, he had discovered, could heal even the deepest wounds, rebuild broken bonds, and ultimately transform a life.